December is a time of cheer and goodwill for most of the world. People exchange gifts, sing songs, houses are decorated, big meals are eaten with friends and family. Molly didn't learn about any of this until she left the village. She'd spent her first happy year away from home, getting odd sidelong stares and hearing repressed mumbles as she asked about their preparations and inquired about their sacrifices. No one seemed to know him, which filled Molly with hope. No one knew what it was like to live in the shadow of his fear, which made Molly hope that she had escaped him. 10 years later, Molly had a home of her own, with a husband to keep her warm on cold nights, and children to fill her heart with joy. She'd worked hard to leave behind all the traces of her old life, moved to America, found a place where she could forget the darker things that still lurked in the old world. Molly's home was covered in lights every December, snowmen standing sentry on the lawn, and her home was filled with the smells of cakes and cookies and the laughter of happy children. It was Christmas Eve again, and Molly was hard at work in the kitchen. Jake was 10, Hannah 6, and Molly had been baking and cooking all day in preparation for tomorrow's dinner. Joseph's family would be coming over to exchange presents, and she wanted this meal to be the best yet. The children were preparing for bed, brushing teeth and washing faces, and as the last of their preparations went into the stove, Molly sat down and sighed happily. Everything was done, everything was ready, and now it was time to relax before Joseph came home and, "Mama, we're ready for our story." Molly sighed, but it was a happy sigh. She'd forgotten about the time. She scratched the bandage on the back of her hand as she made her way to the back of the house. The blood stains on it stood out a little, and when Joseph asked her about it, Molly had told him that she'd burned her hand on the stove. Maybe, she thought, she should tell him what had really happened. The more Molly thought about it, the more she knew that she wouldn't know where to begin. The children were nestled all snug in their beds when Molly arrived, and she took her seat in the big wooden rocker in the middle of the room, asking them what story they wanted to hear. "Three bears?" she asked. "Mama, that's a baby story," Hannah exclaimed, with deep indignation. Mickey Mouse Christmas, maybe?" "Pfft, that book's lame," Jake said, making full use of his new big kid attitude he seemed to have acquired when he turned 10. "Well, what do you want to hear?" Molly asked, rubbing the bridge of her nose as she felt a headache developing. "We want to hear a scary story," said Jake. I want to hear a Christmas story," said Hannah, "that's maybe a little scary." Molly tried to quash her frustration. She was just thinking that she didn't know any scary Christmas stories, but she realized that wasn't true. Molly knew an absolutely terrifying Christmas story, a story that was made all the scarier because it was true, a story made all the more frightening because Molly had lived it. "You want a scary story, do you?" she asked, both leaning forward beneath their covers. "I've got a scary story, if you'd like to hear it." Molly asked the question coyly, knowing they would want to hear. Her children were not the children Molly had grown up with. They were not children of the cold and snow. They wanted to be scared, but they had no clue what genuine fear was. They didn't know what it meant to shiver in the corner as you hear the green one tromp down the street. They'd never felt the terrible cold that signaled the end of someone you loved. Molly prayed they never did, but maybe a taste wouldn't hurt them too badly. Molly almost felt the cold creeping up her legs as she began, returning to a time when she had known the fear she hoped to instill. Mama's not from here. Unlike Daddy, Mama was not born in this great country. Once, she lived in a town called Ingsfield. Ingsfield was a small farming town, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. We had no cars, no phones, no televisions, and our lights came from the candles in the fire we cooked over. Our town was a simple one, our ways just as simple, and that was how we liked it. When autumn began, we began preparing for his arrival. "Whose arrival, Mama?" Hannah asked, her voice a little excited. "His arrival," Molly intoned. "The coming of the Winter Lord." "Whose—" "Hush, children, and listen." Hannah fell silent again, and Molly continued. Harvest was always a time of celebration. The whole town worked together to bring in the bounty of the farmland. The livestock were brought from the fields, and knives were sharpened in preparation for the slaughter. The meat was salted and packaged for storage. Food was stored and canned and placed in cellars for the long winter ahead. And then, when everyone was set aside for winter, we put our excess together and prepared the end of autumn feast. On the last week of what you would call November, we held an autumn fair. It was always held on the village green, a long few acres near the town hall, and was always highly anticipated. There was music at the bandstand, dancing on the pavilion, tables laid with food and drink, games for children, prizes to be won. The celebration went on for a week. Some people celebrated all 7 days and only slept when their bodies demanded it. The people seemed to dance and play all the joy and warmth out of themselves during that week. Many knew that the next 4 months would be hard, knew that they might not see another autumn festival. So they lived a whole year in 1 week, and the whole town seemed to shrink when it was over. On December 1st, we began to feel the real chill of winter. That was when we built the altar. They were both wide-eyed now, their questions squashed for the moment. She drew them in with her story, painted a picture of idyllic life she'd once known, and now came the time for the real story to begin. It was time to show them a place where Santa Claus didn't stop, a land where Christmas trees brought no joy. These symbols would not save you from the Winter Lord, and it was time they knew what waited in the cold and the gloom. The town of happy revelers changed overnight. Now, happy faces red with drink became somber and knowing. They went to the quarry and brought the altar stone, the stone they'd used many and many a, still red with the dried leavings of last year's unfortunate chosen. They spent the week stacking stones and adjusting them just right, so their shape would please him when he came. After a week of stacking and preparing the altar, the offering was chosen, and the contents inspected. The Lord's offering, the last crop planted that year, was harvested, and the vegetables and grain were inspected for flaws that might anger him. Once that was done, 2 calves were chosen and brought forth to be inspected for defects and weaknesses. These were usually the 2 calves who'd taken home the best in show at the autumn fair, and their owners always looked sad, knowing that those 2 would never grow to adulthood, would never know the fear of the sharpened knives next year. Only then, after these things were chosen, did the town choose the real sacrifice. They were shivering now, and why not? Could Molly not feel the coldness in the room? That frigidity couldn't be dispelled by a fire or a blanket. Its coldness was an old one, as old as time and as bleak as the tundra. It had been felt by the first man who shivered in his cave on a winter night. It was the coldness that man felt when the Winter Lord came to his cave and offered him a better way, a darker way. Cold as they were, Molly had their attention. Both were huddled beneath their blankets, shuddering from either cold or fear, but they could not look away. She saw that Hannah wanted her to stop, wanted it all to stop before the story got really scary. Molly could also tell that Jake wished he had never asked for a scary story at all. There was magic in this tale that neither had ever known, making it all the more tantalizing. But they would know of him, even if the knowledge drove them mad in its knowing. The townspeople never chose their sacrifice. They would not have had the nerve to cut their own flock. The mark always chose for them. The mark would appear on the door of the sacrifice, a circle of blood with 3 slashes through it, and the sacrifice would feel it burned into their skin on the back of their hand one night as they slept. Its appearance was unquestioned by any and all, though some sacrifices did claim falseness. I remember the mark being contested only once, and the man's protest made little difference. He owned the biggest farm and the most land within the village. He claimed that his son had made the mark so the father would be put out of his way and his inheritance would be had. His son claimed no part in this, but it mattered not. The farmer had been chosen in the traditional way, and thus he was locked away until the night of the sacrifice. He screamed when that night came, but his screams didn't last long. Some went quiet, some went screaming, but they always went the same way. They went with the cold. At sunset, the snow began to blow in. Sometimes the snow would come before him, but the snow that preceded him was always thick and unforgiving. Snow from the mountaintops that killed if you stayed in it too long. The snow blew and the wind howled, and as the darkness settled over the town, we heard him approach. He came a horse, the steel-shod hooves cutting through the ice as it solidified on the dirt streets of our small town. I remember peeking one year when I was tiny, before my mother saw me and pulled me beneath the sill. I saw him, mounted on his horse. His skeletal horse was thin as a rail, its legs like sticks with frost for skin, and its eyes shone red with the fires of hell as its mane of shadow rippled like thistle from its scaly head. As terrible as he was beautiful when put against his rider. His rider, the Winter Lord, the Green Man, he who accepts the flesh. Though he was man-shaped, that was where the resemblance ended. He came dressed in armor of the deepest forest green, a cape of blue trailing behind him. His cape was ragged, covered in old red stains and stiff with frost, and as it trailed out, you could hear the ice on it break as it snapped in the wind. He held a 2-handed axe in one clawed hand, and whether those claws were armor or his own hands, no one knew. The axe was monstrous, its edge ever dripping with the blood of his victims. He held it down at his side, so it dragged the snow and left a red trail behind him. On his head sat a helmet topped with magnificent antlers, and charms and sigils of unknown meaning hung from those horns. No one had ever seen his face and lived. He kept it hidden beneath his helmet, but his eyes were as red as his horse's. If they fell upon you and met your own, he would raze your hovel to the ground and seek out your bloodline until it was expunged from the earth. He came to town on the 24th of December, a day which had some significance for him. With him came a mighty blizzard. It would cover the town and hide his deeds from sight as he went about his business. There were some who held the idea that he took pity upon the sacrifice and took them back to his realm to be his guests. There were those who believed that those he took would stay in the court of Queen Mab, Fairy Queen of Winter, who must be the ruler of this Winter Lord, and thus his master. Those with hovels close to the altar, those like my family, had no such illusions. Sometimes you could hear them screaming and begging over the wind and hail. Sometimes you could only hear the metallic slap of the axe as he went about his butcher's work. When the storm ended, all that was left was fresh blood upon the altar. All else was taken, never to be seen again. "No way," Jake whispered, but he didn't sound so sure. "You doubt your mother's words?" Molly asked, feeling the old ways of speaking coming back to her. "There's no way this kind of thing could happen. Someone would hear about it and put a stop to it. Plus, why don't they leave? This Winter guy probably wouldn't follow them, right?" She smirked at him. "The people knew what the sacrifice brought them, Jake. If they appeased the Winter Lord, Then the winter only lasted 4 months, and was mellow in the months before spring. With spring would come such a bounty of crops, and on the years when the sacrifice was good, the crops were the best they had ever been. He only took one person. A fair trade for a year of peace and a bountiful harvest, they would say. I, too, said it. I said it for 16 years, until my own time came. Your time? Jake asked, but he knew what his mother meant. Until the mark appeared on my door, until the brand appeared on my hand. My mother cried, and my brother offered to hide me, but my father was staunch in his resolve. The mark cannot be argued. You will go to the council hall and wait for his coming. I spent that week in the mayor's house, awaiting my fate. A dress of snow white was made for me, a garland of green steel forged for my head. Upon my feet were slippers of the softest doeskin, and I just knew they would pinch when I put them on. Many believed that if the sacrifice was female, and the Winter Lord found her beautiful, he might take her to his castle in the mountains and make her his queen of winter, where she might live out her days as his consort and wife. The blood on the altar screamed of their stupidity, but the lies we tell ourselves are often the coziest. I did not need to be dragged to the stones when my time came. I walked up the street, mud squelching against my shoes, as the townspeople watched me with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. We are sorry for your sacrifice, but it must be. Death for you, life for our crops, that look said. Had I not looked at the sacrifice just that way? Had I not known that the mark might appear on my own hand one day? I had been selfish in all those years. I had taken of the town's well, and now it was my time to give. I mounted the altar as the sun began to sink, but despite my assuredness, I didn't feel selfish. Why should I give up my life? I asked myself. Because it was tradition? Because it was expected? Because it had always been? I began to see what I had never seen in the years of living in the town. Why did we give him what he wanted? Why did we let him take? Why didn't we just say no? As young as I was, I shouldn't have been so naive. When the sun began to set, the snow blew up out of nowhere, and the wind only pushed it in my face. I could hear the clomp of his horse as he came on, and as I squinted into the blowing wind, I could make out his antlered helm as he approached the altar. His axe made a sharp sound on the cobbles as he neared, and when he stopped before me, I could see him staring at me from under the visor of his helmet. He hadn't yet raised his axe, and from my vantage point, he seemed to be waiting for something. He was staring at me, his red eyes holding disbelief, and I saw my opportunity at that moment. I jumped from the altar, snow and ice battering me on all sides, and ran towards the woods. He screamed into the gathering night, and his voice sounded like the howl of an angry east wind. He came after me, hooves thundering steps behind me, but as I entered the woods I was ready for him. I'd played in these woods all my life, and I knew it would be impossible for a horse, even a horse as thin as his, to move quickly amongst the tightly packed trees. The forest flowed around me in a long brown blur, and I heard him roar as he realized he couldn't just ride me down. I heard his axe slap futilely into a tree as I ran, but I didn't stop to see what he was doing. I ran and ran until I found a burrow in the bottom of an ancient tree. I sank into it, ignoring the roots and spider webs that nestled there. I spent that night shivering amongst the bitter cold. As I shivered, I heard something I had not expected to hear. I heard the screams of the town as he laid it to waste. Other people ran into the woods, but took no notice of my hiding place. They ran like frightened rabbits, certain he would be behind them, but I knew better. They would die of cold, likely I would too. But as I pulled at the crunchy leaves that the hollow had swallowed up, I felt surer and surer that I would survive. I bided there till morning, the screaming dying out in the wee hours, and when I awoke, I was homeless and an orphan. I returned to the town long enough to get my things and leave. The houses were destroyed, hollow husks that would sit silent forever. The few people who still abided there looked at me with sullen eyes full of hate. They wanted to hurt me, wanted to kill me, but these sheep had stood by as their friends and family were taken by that winter night. I knew they would not raise their hands against me, and when I left for good. "What did you do then, Mama?" asked Hannah, her lip trembling as my story finally ended. "I met your father 6 months later. He was backpacking through Europe and took me as another backpacker. I'd been homeless for the last 6 months, scrounging food and looking over my shoulder for him. When he offered to let me come with him, I accepted. By the time we reached London, we were in love. And when he brought me to America to meet your grandparents, we were already planning to be married. That's how I came to be in America. That's how I came to escape the place of my birth." She let them sleep then, kissing their foreheads and turning off the light. Molly could hear them rolling in their beds, their dreams filled with ice. A fitful sleep was better than nothing, though. Molly sighed as she came into the living room. She hadn't told them everything, of course. How could you tell children everything? Sometimes the truth only brings fear. Molly took off the bandage and looked at the burn on the back of her hand. The circle with 3 slashes through it was as plain as it had been on the night she was to be sacrificed. Its meaning was as clear now as it had been then, too. He was coming for his lost sacrifice. She went to the window and looked out into the backyard. Molly could see him there, mounted on his ice horse, staring at her balefully with his piercing red orbs. He stood between the children's swing set and the wooden play fort they'd gotten last Christmas, looking as out of place as an altar stone at an autumn festival. 10 years was a long reprieve, she reflected, and as Molly stood holding his gaze, she knew what must be done. Joseph wouldn't understand, and the kids would be devastated, but maybe her sacrifice would stop them from being involved. As Molly opened the sliding door on the back porch, she felt the winter blizzard kiss her face as it had on that night 10 years ago. He walked his horse towards her, and as the axe came down, Molly knew there would be no throne of winter for her. She spread her arms and welcomed him to his sacrifice. Molly welcomed winter as her people had for generations, with blood and resolve. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story and you haven't already, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. While you're here, maybe go ahead and give that video a like and drop a comment. I like it when people comment. If you're not too spooked and you think you might can handle a little more, why not go ahead and click on one of those other videos that's about to pop up. Maybe check out one of our playlists. There's quite a few. If you'd like to support the channel more monetarily, I'd suggest maybe you go pick up a copy of my latest book. There's a link below. Or maybe head on over to Patreon. I have quite a few tiers. I'm sure there's one that'll suit you best. Speaking of Patreon, let's go ahead and thank our patrons, shall we? Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. And thanks to Winters, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're a fan of my books, I always recommend go ahead and join that Ghostly Reader tier. $10 a month, and it also gets you a book anytime I write one, which is around twice a year usually. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.